Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Latsko, and I am presenting today in collaboration with the Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion and their Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion meeting network series. And I'll be presenting on diversity, equity, inclusion, DE&I, and social media. So for those of you who don't know me, like I said, my name is Rachel Latsko. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Marketing Communications Manager for Student Affairs at CMU. I've been working in higher ed marketing communications for around 8 years now, 3 of those at CMU. I was previously at Pitt before I came here. DE&I is central to the work that we do here. Whether it's creating a space of belonging on the Life at CMU Instagram channel, whether it's going into a residence hall and figuring out, how can we design this space to connect students to where they live, both locally and then to the city and even globally. It's at the center of all of our work and at the center of our values in student affairs. And again, although I'm not a DE&I expert, DEI is an integral part of a social media strategy, especially here at CMU, because it helps to build a community and a sense of belonging. When I was thinking about how to present this presentation, I really wanted to think about, what's going to be most useful to you as you're working with your peers, your supervisors. What's some kind of tangible information that you can take away right at the start of this, and then some stuff to start thinking about when you're going to go back now into your offices and plan and strategize and think about how you're going to do this storytelling. I will also not be going super in depth with all of these subjects since we do only have an hour, but please know that you can definitely have access to the PowerPoint afterwards. So yeah, let's jump right in. So any of you that probably have a dog, a pet, a partner, maybe a child or a friend that you've been scrolling through your phone on social media totally knows this look that they give you, right? And, when I was starting this presentation, I was like, what is the newest statistic on how much time that we spend on our phones scrolling through social? So take a guess, see if you can think about how many minutes on average per day does the average person now spend on social media across the globe. For those of you with iPhones, you might get this update at the end of each week telling you how many hours you spent on it, and you maybe ignore it. Just take a guess. So the total is 147 minutes a day, a little over 2 hours, right? At first, this didn't seem, too crazy to me, but when I really started breaking it down and doing the math, we spend more than a month of our lives now per year on social media. So when we start to have these discussions, in society about going into the metaverse or, going into virtual reality, spending our time online, we already do that, right? So it's really important when we think about that of how can we make this space, especially at CMU, where students are spending a majority of their lives, an inclusive space. So let's talk about why this matters. Why does accessibility, why does DE&I work in social media matter? Well, first of all, it's the core of our brand. When you really think about what we tell CMU as, what we say our values are, first of all, we always talk about we're on the leading edge of human progress. We're into innovation. We're always striving to do better, right? I love this quote that I kind of abbreviated. We learn, we make, we solve, we create, and we give it to the world. We are bold in our approach to benefit all of humankind. So if we're thinking about all of humankind, we have to include everyone, right? So we have to think about how we can be accessible to make sure that our messages are reaching everyone, and how we can create the sense of belonging that invites everyone into the conversation. Another thing that I really wanted you to walk away with this presentation today is a lot of times I have people come to me and say, I care about this work, or I know this work matters, but maybe, I'm trying to convince my peers in this space. I'm trying to convince other professionals. Maybe I'm trying to convince a supervisor of why this should be a part of our strategy. Well, I want you to walk away today with some actual data that can support you in this space so that when you have that conversation, you can also come with some numbers that hopefully will change their mind and get them to buy in further. So one thing that's really important with especially accessibility, but I think again, all of these things can relate to inclusion as well, is really thinking about how it impacts really everyone in our audience at CMU, right? Especially those who may live with a short-term or long-term disability and or require assistance at some point. You never know when you may have an accident or you get something in your eye where now you can't, see out of it for a couple of days, and you might have to use some assistive technology at some point. So it's more prevalent than I think most people think. According to the CDC here, you can see around 26% of adults in the US have some type of disability. And although some of us who maybe are a little bit familiar with accessibility work may say, yeah, like I'm familiar with like a lot of vision, stuff that has to do with vision and, maybe using a screen reader technology. But accessibility guidelines include a range of people. For example, those with also vision, hearing, mobility, and cognitive disabilities. A lot of times these accessibility features that we use, say example of putting captions on a video, can really help someone with a cognitive disability, that it helps them focus on the content that they're looking at. And you can see here that this issue is not going to go away. It's only expected that more people will, have more disabilities in the future, or again, have some type of impairment. So if we're thinking about how we can be innovative and be proactive, this is something that we need to consider. Okay, so also too, when we're thinking about, hey, we want to get our content to people, right? What does it matter if we create this really valuable, great content and people can't access it? Well, there's a lot of industry statistics that also support this work. For example, just in general, you can see the majority of users will actually watch videos with the sound turned off. And I'm sure you can think of any time that you may have been, commuting on the bus, maybe you're in between meetings, and you yourself listen to it without the sound on, right? So captions are crucial for understanding just the context of what is happening in most videos. Also, just a stat coming off Instagram that users are more likely to also watch your videos if they have captions on. Another issue that's been growing is thinking about legal and compliance around accessibility. I reference Alexa Heinrich a lot in this presentation. They are such an advocate in this accessibility space on social. They actually have created their own company called Accessible Social. And I'll shout that out a lot in this presentation, because I think as a follow-up, I would definitely, anyone watching this, please go check that out. They go way more in depth with all this stuff, and I think it's just organized so well, and obviously is super accessible. But you can see Alexa says here that a lot of digital disability, accessibility lawsuits focus on websites of brands and companies, but it's not unrealistic to think that it's also going to spread to social media platforms and apps as well. And you can see here, based on those stats below, that, this again is only a growing field. So it's something to definitely be aware of when you are thinking about time and money that can come about if you're not following these type of guidelines. Also, like I said, thinking future forward, it's an investment. When you're thinking about how we talk on these social spaces, a lot of what you can see business execs are saying, social companies, tech companies, that social is really going to become this dominant channel for social messaging, for external communication, for customer experience even. I've even seen an article that was saying that Gen Z uses TikTok like the rest of, whoever older than them uses Google, right? Like they go to these channels to get information from them. So we need to make sure that information is accessible, right? Also, consumers are now more than ever choosing brands that match their values, and they want to see their values showcased, externally and on these channels, right? You can see there, Gen Z, for example, some of the stuff that they expect when they're interacting with companies. But this, one thing I do want to mention though, is this trend isn't just dominated by Gen Z or millennials, either, with more than 2/3 of customers over 40 seeking seamless engagement with brands. So again, just really thinking about, this is where more people are having these discussions in this space. How can we be more innovative and adapt to them? And lastly, social media is supposed to be a conversation. If you're not doing these things, again, using these accessibility tools, creating a space to invite people in, you're already not inviting them to the table, right? You're not inviting them to the conversation. And I just can't imagine any of these lovely people that are on my screen right now, not having them be a part of that conversation, right? So now we'll dive into how to make your content accessible, which also I just want to emphasize will also make it inclusive, right? So these tie together, they're not two separate parts. I just labeled them part 1 and part 2 just for organizational purposes. And like I said, I'm going to go kind of a little bit light on these topics because I want you to be able to say, okay, after I leave this presentation, these are the 5 things that I can easily implement into my social strategy, right? So you can see here again that I'm shouting out Alexa Heinrich. Again, they have a website called Accessible Social, but they also turned it into a book. Super fun. I have it linked in the presentation. But just so you know, the top 5, things that I focus on for a accessible social strategy are utilizing alt text, creating captions, being selective and strategic with icons, emojis, special characters, designing with color and contrast in mind when we're thinking about graphics and images on social. And then also, probably one of the most important in my mind is also tailoring your content to the platform. So diving into alt text, alternative text, nicknamed alt text, is essentially written copy that physically describes an image in a digital space. Another thing I want to emphasize is this is not just for screen reader technology. Alt text also works on a page, also works if a page doesn't load. So it really does tell people, no matter what, how they're coming to your page, what's happening there. It gives them the context of the page. And another thing that was very interesting when I was building this presentation was it was originally scheduled to take place a couple months ago. It got rescheduled a first time and then a second time. And actually, over the span of these couple months, social has really changed with embracing accessibility standards. I think at the beginning of this, Instagram still didn't have all of their different features friendly with alt text, but now they do. Same thing with Twitter. And so since then, there's really been this discussion in the social media space about how now that we have this alt text field that we can describe our photos in, right? Now it's kind of saying, okay, how much like humor do we inject into it? What's the personality? Can we have fun with the brand voice and the tone? And I say yes. However, I think being a university account, we really should speak in plain language. And while you definitely can keep your own, tone and voice, for example, Life at CMU has a little bit more of a playful, more student focused language of how we talk about stuff and how we write captions, maybe say versus the Carnegie Mellon account, or maybe versus one of your college accounts, for example, that, you do want to sound more, serious and, coming from a place of discipline, of knowledge, right? However, I think you should still speak in plain language. Yes, there are brands that are maybe being super humorous and funny, but I really don't think that that's as necessary for a university account. So, like I said, let's go into kind of what some of that plain language consists of. These are my do's of alt text. So short is best. I usually aim for thinking about that you're like writing a tweet, right? There used to be some discussion in the accessible social community that screen readers used to cut your alt text off after 125 characters, including spaces. However, I think that was just a rumor, and actually a lot of platforms allow you to go beyond the 125 characters. However, I still think you should shoot around for thinking about, 140 characters, maybe up to 200. Think of it as, again, you're writing a tweet. I think, different people who utilize screen reader technology are just like people who read books, right? Some people like really like flowery language, like a lot of descriptors. Some people prefer it to be very short and concise. But at the end of the day, you don't want it to be a burden for this person to read it, where they're now having to get through a paragraph to go to your next piece of content, right? So really try to think about it as how can you make it easy for them to understand and for them to take away what's that main subject of your photo, right? So you're going to prioritize important details. And just also to remember that this isn't a tool for search engine optimization, also known as SEO, growth hack. This isn't a place to embed keywords. You're really supposed to be describing what's happening in the picture, right? I think really essential to this presentation as well are signifying that identifiers are okay, but asking yourself if they're contextually important to the photo. Identifiers include anything like gender, ethnic background, orientation, again, how students might particularly identify, things that are culturally sensitive, like hairstyles, calling stuff out like that. Think, does it make sense for your channel? If I'm maybe the Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion and I'm hosting a Pride event, I think it's totally okay as long as the people to identify maybe some people in the queer in the photo as members of the queer community or members of the LGBTQ community. But again, I think be really careful about this. If you don't know that type of information, I always say for people to use students when you're describing students, staff, faculty, more, just common type of signifiers versus again being super specific with stuff. But again, if you're an organization that you're like the Black graduate student organization, I think maybe it's totally fine if you're trying to get the context of the photo to be a place of belonging. Again, calling out that, who is in your photo. I think that's okay. Proper names are okay if it's well known. I think be careful with this one though. For example, I think President Barnum Jahanian is someone that people know, so just referring to him as that is okay. But I think sometimes we overestimate how many people know who are people at the university, maybe professors, stuff like that. So avoid using like first names, use their full name. Same thing goes for acronyms, especially people that maybe speak English as a second language. Acronyms are really not inclusive. You're assuming one, that they have a complete grasp of the language, and then two, that they also have this body of knowledge of like who your office is or what your program is. And higher ed loves a good acronym, but you really should spell it out as much as you can, or at least have it spelled out one place and then have it abbreviated somewhere else, right? So you can even see in my alt text, I don't say HOCs, which is typically what the head orientation counselors call themselves. I spell out head orientation counselors. I do use CMU as an abbreviation, but that's pretty well known at our university as an acronym. And then, just again, looking at that alt text, I also, I'm a little bit more where I like to be a little bit more descriptive with my alt text. So, I said that they leap upward with their arms outstretched. Again, giving them that sense of, it's not just like they're jumping up a little bit, right? They're really leaping. They're jumping high into the air. Again, here's where this more relaxed tone at Lakefit CMU comes in. We say, and relaxed voice, we say repping their residential neighborhoods in their brightly colored sweatshirts. Called that out just because I think the sweatshirts really make this picture pop against the backdrop of Hammerschlag Hall. And you can see here, I didn't just say a backdrop of Hammerschlag, I said Hammerschlag Hall because it is a specific place and we can't assume that everyone knows what Hammerschlag is or where it is, right? And then lastly, if you do include copy on images, which I really advise against not doing because they're not accessible, but if you do include it, you have to include it. Any type of text overlay that you have, again, that's just the text over the image. You have to include that in your alt text. You can do this by saying, red background, text overlay reads, and then whatever your text is, if it's like the letter CMU over a photo that you have, again, you can say text overlay reads CMU. But my thing is, I think we really need to be thinking about, is having that text super important to the image? Is there a way that I can find an image or a video that tells the story where I can just easily put the copy in the caption where everyone can read it? My don'ts of alt text. You don't have to include photo of or image of in the alt text caption. The computer will already, the code, the screen reader, the tool, whatever technology they're using, will already be reading that in the code. So it'll signify to them that it's an image and then it'll read your description. So you don't need to include that intro. Don't use hashtags in there. Again, like I said, this isn't an SEO growth hack. This isn't a place to try to like boost the algorithm, right? You're just making it longer for someone who's using a screen reader to read it. And also, don't throw in stuff that doesn't match the context or the subject of your content. You can see in this example, I threw in diversity. Again, is this a photo that really has to do with diversity? Is it just that I'm doing it because I think I'll, again, will improve my algorithm, or, I'm just doing it to do it. I also threw in a pretty viral hashtag that has a lot of people following it, that OOTD, which is outfit of the day. And lastly, don't include any copy that you just couldn't fit into the caption. I don't see this as much with higher ed, but I see this a lot with brands. They couldn't fit some of the features of the brand in there. So now that they're describing it in the alt text, that's not what it's for. Keep it again to what the context of the photo is. So if you were all with me, we could totally go over these together and do them live, but I'm just going to quickly go over them with you. This is a photo of CMU pre-college students. This is one you can see that we had on Life at CMU, and I will show you what I did to describe it. I do think just initially looking at this image that it's definitely a lot more moodier. There's definitely some artsy elements to it. So I was a little bit more, I spoke a little bit more in that tone when I was writing this alt text. So you can see here, I say a trio of pre-college students pose. So that's again, giving them kind of the subject of the photo, looking away from the camera and holding shopping bags and totes. Again, it's helping you with context, it's adding some drama to the photo. On a Pittsburgh street with the sun setting behind them, also giving you context. The sun rays burst through the trio towards the camera and reflect off the cement pavement. To me, again, this is really just conveying the beauty of this picture. You're also really just emphasizing that it has this city feel. They're downtown. You're talking about the cement, right? So this is one that maybe is a little bit longer. This one is an example of thinking about if you are putting text over an image, how you can write the alt text for it. I kind of gave you a preview of what this alt text could be earlier in this presentation, but you can see here that I tried to bring some branding into it. So I called it Carnegie Red background with white text overlay that reads, and then if you can't see it, it does say defining diversity, pluralism, noun, and then the pronunciation pluralism. One thing I'll note on here, and you kind of see it on our screen as well, and I'll talk about this later in the presentation, when you are thinking about color and contrast, you can see here that even us looking at the screen, the defining diversity and the noun pluralism is a little bit hard to read. So that's kind of one of my things when you're thinking about using text on photos, is making sure that it's readable, making sure that the weight, bolding when you can, using different weights of font, that you're really thinking about that too, not just for people using screen readers, but just using, anyone that might be looking at your image, making sure that those are highly readable. This is a little bit hard to read. And again, that's kind of the danger zone you can get into with putting text on images. Okay, so thinking about emojis and special characters. I have a great video that I think really illustrates everything that's on this slide here. So I'm just going to skip to it, but I will say, be selective and really try to prioritize written content in your captions and on social, right? I think you can definitely still have fun with emojis, but I want you kind of maybe after looking at this video to be a little bit more strategic and thinking about it. Also, I don't think people always realize that emojis do have their own specific unique description attached to them, and they're probably longer than you think. They can also change per device. And we're going to see some examples in the video that I'm going to play in a second. But if you are ever interested in the descriptions of the different emojis, Emojipedia, which I have linked on this slide, is an amazing resource where you can, again, double check all the descriptions of the emojis.
If you plan to use emoji in your social media content, you should know that each emoji icon has its own unique description assigned to it. A screen reader will read this description aloud when it comes across an emoji in written content. Even emojis with custom skin tones get an additional identifier added to their description to keep them unique, as demonstrated in the tweet on the left.
Alexa, at Alexa testing 123, looking forward to the holidays with my family, good food, good laughs, good company, and good times. Bring on the holiday cheer, snowflake, Christmas tree, yellow 5-pointed star, Santa Claus with light skin tone, white heart, non-binary person with medium, light skin tone dressed as Santa Claus, present, snowman surrounded by snowflakes, snowflake.
Emojis should be placed at the end of your posts and tweets so that the important information is consumed by a user first and any clarity issues are avoided. You'll notice in this middle tweet that the content became confusing once a screen reader read it aloud.
Alexa, at Alexa testing 123, having an amazing time on vacation in Colorado's snow-capped mountain. Gonna get some prime skiing in tomorrow skiing, before ending the day with hot cocoa hot beverage. By the fire with my love face blowing a kiss.
The excessive use of emojis is also not advised, as it can sometimes make your content longer than you originally intended. Or, if you frequently create emoji illustrations, keep in mind that screen readers often truncate a line of emojis if only one specific icon is used, as demonstrated in the tweet on the right.
Alexa, at Alexa testing 123, nothing like spending the day at the beach, relaxing, digging my toes in the sand, playing in the blue waves, and soaking up hours upon hours of sunshine. 10 sun.
For other tips, tricks, and information on how you can be accessible with.
All right, so like I said, I don't want you to think that you can't ever have fun with emojis or be playful with them. It's just now knowing that, there are some accessibility issues around where you place them. So just being really strategic moving forward when you are thinking about using emojis. Another type of visual thing that we can include in our content, ACSII, or you can see what the long name for it is, and Unicode, again, universal character set characters, text are not accessible. Also, just so you know, Unicode, ASCII is essentially a universal computer language. But you can see here below some examples, the little art there with the art is not accessible, the kind of different fonts and whatnot. They aren't accessible. And actually, if some screen readers read over these, they will actually play these really guttural, inaudible, horrible sounding sounds. So this is just really something to avoid. I don't see this as much on university accounts per se, but sometimes like I've seen sorority accounts use the trendy font. And here's an example of just when I was on LinkedIn the other day, was looking at my Penn State Alumni Association, and I saw this post, and here's an example of using the Unicode text. So you can see that this person who was a career coach was trying to like kind of be creative with how they were bolding some of their main statements. However, if a screen reader was reading that, it would not read any of what is bolded there. So this is just something to just be aware of. Again, if you are thinking of like changing up how some of your stuff looks, that you really want to avoid any type of this ACSII and Unicode text. All right, now let's think about videos and captioning. People who use captions, people who are deaf cannot hear the audio, people also that are just hard of hearing and can't hear certain content. Also, a lot of people with cognitive and learning disabilities who need to see and hear the content to better understand it are all people that utilize captions. Earlier in the presentation, you definitely saw how there's also just a lot of data that backs up that a lot of people just now watch videos with the sound off. So captions are just really important and a great way of also improving the length of watch time, also helping people understand what's happening in your video. One thing that I wanted to emphasize is that I don't go too in depth on this just because, again, you can really get granular when you're thinking about captions, but I wanted to provide you with some of my tips that whenever I'm thinking about captioning that are kind of my go-tos in this space. I think one thing that's really important is labeling the speakers, especially if you have more than one person, it's great to signify when that speaker is changing. For example, this is a video that we had, or a screenshot of a video that we had showing off the residence halls on campus, and Zoe and Juno were giving a room tour. And you can see here at the example when they were ending it and saying goodbye, we just have Zoe speaking in parentheses and then Juno speaking in parentheses. And so that's just a really easy way, again, is keep different people are talking. Even if one person is talking at the beginning of the video, I advocate to name who they are and say that they are speaking. This is another example of just remembering to label music. Music has such an impact on the understanding and the context of a video. It can really change the feel, it can change the understanding. For example, just because this is trending with the new Rings of Power coming out, I have a snippet of the Lord of the Rings. This is a famous scene where the Fellowship decides to keep pursuing their goal. And if any of you know that typically during this scene, there's this very beautiful instrumental score that's this epic music that plays, right? There's some type of comical music playing. You could see here that if that funny music was playing, you would have a completely different feel to it, right? So in this instance, you want to be able to label what type of music that is. Again, if at the start of a video, you kind of have uplifting music, you can call it instrumentals if you want, like happy instrumentals. Just go ahead and do that by putting that in brackets. So next, we also want to think about labeling important sound effects. And again, important means understanding, or excuse me, necessary to understanding the enjoyment of the media. For example, if we're looking at the two photos on our screen, if we're looking at the one on the left, you know, without that audience cheering, if you take that away, what if the audience was booing? What if there's maybe, you know, a lightning storm that strikes that guy and that's actually why he's taking the ball? You know, you want to enable to understand if that scene is a good positive thing happening. You would want to know, are they cheering? Are they booing? What's happening in the background? Also, if you look on the one to the right with the smoke, you know, if we see explosions there, we kind of get the gist of it. But if you take that away, that could just be a cloudy day, that could be fog, that could be some type of like magic stuff happening in the background. But because we use the our captions there, we know that it's from explosions, right? So just again, just something to think about. You know, especially if maybe you have videos of sports, or if you have a scientific experiment that you're showcasing with their sound, and you know, the sound effects are important. It's definitely something to include. All right, so now we're jumping into designing with color and contrast in mind. This is, I say, one always after my own heart, because I am a graphic designer, an artist, and I love making beautiful images that engage people. But the key is that you want to be able to engage them, you want to be able to see it and understand it. And on social media, we really should prioritize using as little graphics as possible. And when I'm talking about graphics, I mean, you know, again, anything where you're maybe having an image, an illustration with also text over it, for example. You know, when people are maybe sharing posters, I know that we want to create these really great visual images, but you really have to think about what platform you're on. When you're looking at these on a screen, it can be very hard to interpret what's on there. Here's an example. If you look to the right of color and contrast, you can see there, you know, the green on the red is going to be really hard for anyone to see, let alone maybe someone that has a color vision deficiency or maybe has a cognitive disability. You can see here that some color pairing also causes text to look like it's vibrating. So that's something you want to be careful of as well. So my suggestion is always think about how you can really keep it as simple as possible and utilize as minimal colors that you can. You know, especially if you're thinking maybe about Instagram story, you know, if you are using one of the Instagram's text features over top of a, you know, a background image, thinking, you know, can you put a, you know, a dark background behind your text instead of just using the text on its own, right? Another thing to think about is also like full black is sometimes really hard for people to see on the screen. So using maybe like a little bit shade lighter than black, that's just something to be aware of. Another thing that I think is just a bonus kind of fact to this, you know, this concept is color vision deficiency, or otherwise sometimes called color blindness, actually affects 1 in 12 men. And the last stat I have from when I used to do a lot of our social media presentations with Felicia Lucott, who used to be part of the UCM, the University Communications Marketing social media team. When we would give this presentation, 46% of Carnegie Mellon's audience is actually male, and that's on Instagram. So if you're thinking about, you know, you have around 8 or 10% of men who have this color vision deficiency, it's something to think about when you're putting all these colors on our images. And, you know, just to clarify too, a lot of times people think color vision deficiency or color blindness means they can't see a color, but that's not typically the case. There are different types of color vision deficiency, and sometimes it's actually seeing different shades of colors. So when I think I'm doing a really cool image where I'm putting purple and green together, they might actually be only seeing the purple as a little bit shade darker than green. So if you're really putting important information in purple, they might not be able to read it. So again, it's just thinking about, if you are using text, if you are putting it over top of images, you know, how can you keep that as clear, you know, and just being as strategic as possible. And lastly, this is the number one that you can walk away with today. Please, please, please tailor your content to the platform. Your content should be mobile first and accurately sized to the platform. If you do any type of just Google search, you can always just look up like what are the most up-to-date dimensions for each platform. But this means no flyers or posters, excuse me, repurposed as content. This is a big one. You really need to show that you're adding value to this experience of someone being on social. This isn't just, again, having a flyer sent to you and reposting the flyer. You should be doing your due diligence to create the correct content for the platform. There are so many different CMU accounts at this university. The market is, we can say the market, whatever, is very saturated for people to be able to stop and actually look at your photo. It needs to be sized correctly and shown correctly to the audience to gauge their interest, to make them to stop and pause and look at your content. Also, you really should avoid using flattened text. Again, flattened text is any type of text that you have on a, you know, on a photo that you're sharing in your story, in the feed. Also, if you are thinking about, you know, putting a lot of, text on images, think about where this long form content should better live. Is it maybe linking to an Instagram story where people can click through multiple images versus trying to read it all on your one photo, right? Or better yet, can you link to a website that's more accessible to see this full story? Or again, putting the majority of that in the caption where we know it's an accessible space for them to read. And then lastly, links should always be clickable and actionable. Links do not belong on photos if they can't click it. Links do not belong in the caption if they can't click it. If you can refer them to maybe go to your, if you have a type of like link in bio situation, Instagram now lets you, no matter what number of followers you have, use the clickable link stickers, which are really great now that we can use. So that should be something that if you can direct people to story, that's where you can put those links. And just as this is a fun fact, think about when you are putting where people can click on those type of links down in the lower portion of your photos, because that's most people hold their phone using their thumb. So you want it in an area that it's easy for them to click on. So that's just a little bonus content that you got here. So this is an example of this idea of the long form story. I just wanted to like give you a visual for this. So this was actually on the main Carnegie Mellon channel. So what they would have done was they would have had a photo in their feed that maybe showcased this couple or one of the couples. And then they said, go check out our story go check out our Instagram story for this Tartan love story. And then you can see there, you can actually click through some of the different ones. Also, I think a way to make this even better, say you had a couple couples maybe you interviewed, you could have that last slide say, and check out the rest of our couples on our website, and then have that clickable link sticker on there. So then they can actually go see all of the stories, including this one, right? And then another, just a bonus again of thinking about maybe why you would want to put some of this like longer form information into story. The way the algorithm is now, it's a lot harder with feed posts to be shown to all of your followers. If you look at any of your Instagram stats, you probably will see that, the accounts reached. So that's out of the accounts that like follow you, right? Your story will, if you have something in story, it's always going to appear at the top of whoever follows you along with the other stories, right? So if someone's scrolling through that, they're always going to see you there, but they won't necessarily see you in your feed. This is why usually you see a lot higher views when you're thinking about stories. So just kind of a little nudge to get you to think about why you would want to put that type of content into a story space, say for example on Instagram. So this was again a grading CMU post. If we were together again, I would totally invite you to give them a letter grade. And again, this is not to shame anyone. I have worked with all of these accounts and I have seen their great social stuff that they have done, their great photos and images. This is just a tool to be a time to be for a learning experience. So if we're looking at this one, this is for CMU Sands. They are an a cappella group on campus. If you can't read what the caption says, I have it cut off, but it says, come watch us dorm storm all the freshman dorms tomorrow. Please fill out our interest form, ... And the rest of it's in the caption. But you can see when we're looking at this, there's a lot going on, right? We have lots of flattened text on this images. We have lots of logos on this image. We actually have written out tags on this image. We also have times, locations, the date, it's free, it's right at your doorstep. But you have to think about if you're scrolling through your feed, is this something that you would stop on and maybe take the time to read the information? Most likely you're going to scroll right past it. Also, none of this is accessible, and I doubt that they wrote every single word in the alt text that is on here. If they did, I'm so sorry. But again, when you're looking at this, my kind of initial grade was a D. And the only reason I didn't give them a worse one was because they do have in their caption to fill out the interest form via the link in their bio. So they didn't put their link anywhere on the image or in the captions. That was good on them. But if I was thinking of ways to improve this, I know that they have great photos or videos, because again, they're a singing group. So it would really lend themselves to have a video of someone singing. They could easily have a photo from each one of those a cappella groups that they focus at the top and do a carousel image where you slide through it. To me, I think that would be one of the best ways to go, or even if they just have a photo of themselves singing, right? Or maybe again, if someone's in front of a dorm, to again, give more context to this photo. And then you could actually go, and if you did have a photo from every group that they could leverage, as, throughout all of their different posts, then you can actually put the actual tags on there instead of writing them out, because then people can click on them. So they're actionable, right? And then all of that information about the schedule and whatnot can easily be put into the caption. That's where it's going to be accessible. And then again, if there's, they're clicking on to fill out that interest form, you can repeat the information there. This is another one of our student organizations. This is Salsa CMU's, the Spanish and Latino Student Association. I really liked their little fun graphic that they created at the bottom. You can see that we have less text here, a little bit easier to read. That kind of shadow that they did on the text is kind of hard to read in my opinion. Also, I don't know if you noticed, but they have a spelling error in September. This can happen a lot when you're putting text on images, and it's hard once you post it, you can't go edit it, where if you make a mistake in the caption, you can go back and edit it. I actually was being very nice. I gave them a B- just because I liked the graphic at the bottom. I really think that they didn't need any of the text on the top of it. I think they could have just easily had this little kind of fun illustration of people sitting at at the fair, again, lecturing, talking to each other. It looks like they have a little sign up on their desk. So yeah, I gave them a B-. Again, what I would do is I would just take the text off of that and put it into the caption. And lastly, I have an example from CMU Modern Languages Department. If you can't read the caption, it says answering your modern languages FAQs. And then you can see there that they are posting some FAQs, like, do I need to speak another language to take a modern language course? And then they have their answers, following those questions. I gave this an A because I think, one, that it's a really great image that matches what they're saying, and they didn't have to write, Q&A as text on top of the image and put it there, or just, again, write answering your FAQs. They have this great image that looks like people are engaged in a meaningful discussion, maybe asking questions. So I think that this works really well. You can see here that they answer the FAQs in the caption. I also think that maybe you could always also post the FAQ questions into story. So answering them there as well. And then you can actually say, hey, go check out our story. And you can always save that as a highlight so that that content's evergreen in a highlight space on Instagram. And just to wrap up this section, there are a ton of great accessibility resources in CMU, and then I put globally as well. The CMU web team has their own web accessibility guidelines, so that's a link there that you can click on. I really want to shout out Kimberly Norris, who's part of CMU, who did this amazing digital accessibility mini workshop series. That links you to she has a YouTube channel that lists all of those little mini workshops, and they go way in depth in a lot of these subjects. And they also talk about multimedia, color, creating accessible documents, images and infographics, websites, and data visualization. So it kind of goes beyond social if you're interested in this content. Other things that I would advocate: join the Accessible Social group on Facebook that Alexa Heinrich runs. Like I said, really great community there that's very engaged, will answer questions that you have, will probably make you aware of things you didn't know. Same thing also, if you're in any type of higher ed social role, social media role, definitely join that higher ed social group on Facebook, hashtag higher ed social. They're an amazing resource that, it's such an active community. There is just so much rich information and helpful people in there. So definitely join that if you can. Also, if you're really into the accessibility stuff, the Web Content and Accessibility Guidelines WCAG Ally group on Facebook could be another great resource. Just know that they are, sometimes I even get a little overwhelmed in that group because there's a lot of knowledge, deep knowledge around that subject and discipline specific knowledge. So if you're not familiar with coding language and whatnot, it could be a little over your head, but if you're into that stuff, that is a great group for you to join. All right, so thinking about leading with inclusive storytelling. Again, when I was thinking about how I was going to go about this and, getting you set up to start thinking about inclusive storytelling, I really just kept thinking about how so much of it is just always all about people. And, a lot of times I have people come to me that will say, how do I approach this person for this story? How do I make sure I'm not tokenizing someone when it's a certain month of the year and I'm reaching out to them, maybe because I know they identify with that background, or, they're from this ethnic background and I'd love to do a story on them. Like, how do I navigate that ask, right? Like, how do I navigate thinking about how do I write this content without just like singling anyone out? And I just couldn't help but think about, one, why do you feel uncomfortable? I think that's just a question we can always ask ourselves. It's good to reflect on that, right? One, I think it's good being a little uncomfortable, right? Like it helps you grow, but also where is that coming from? And I think sometimes that uncomfortability comes from feeling like it's a transactional relationship. And so my big thing is thinking about where you can build and manage these relationships long term. So you're not just kind of thinking short term and using a short term strategy when you're thinking about your social calendar, right? Like it's a long semester long journey, a year long journey versus this kind of month to month and like person to person. So again, where can you show up for them? Students post their general body meetings, post their events on social, on the new Tartan Connect platform that you can attend. You can always ask them, hey, can I stop by? If you're just around on campus, go grab a coffee if you can, and just stop by and say hi at a table. Just introducing yourself and talking to the students goes such a long way. And then also thinking about how can you offer maybe resources that some of these groups or some of these people that you're reaching out to, would love to have or don't normally have access to. For example, we have a student affairs photographer, Jeremy, who's first of all just great and amazing. He's a talented photographer. But one thing I sometimes offer is like when I see students putting on an event, I'm like, hey, I'd love to showcase your student organization. Can I have Jeremy stop by, take some photos that your org can use for your own purposes as well, right? A lot of times orgs just love getting exposure and having their student orgs love having their information shared, love having their photos shared. But think about, when you're approaching people for stories, what is that, where can you give back to them too? So it's not this transactional relationship. For example, when I created a Life at CMU Slack channel, this was a big place where I felt like I could give back to a student community. For example, the Life at CMU Slack is a platform where all student PR, communication, social media chairs, they're all in this channel, along with some staff as well. I used to have the university communications and marketing team in there, but there's some student affairs professionals as well. So if you are a social media person at the university that would love to have this connection with students, I totally invite you to join. My email was at the beginning of this presentation. Please reach out to me. I'd rather do it like a one-on-one invite, just so I know who's going in there and I can add you to the right channels. But this space is really a place for me to share. I share knowledge and tips about social media so that I'm kind of giving them some education while they're in there in the social space. So that's me trying to give them showcase some value that I can, again, impart this wisdom and knowledge I can impart to them. So it isn't just me in there asking, hey, can someone, do a story on this for us? But also the channel is a place for that. It's a place for students to interact with each other, students to interact with staff. So we have more transparency in that sense that they can also talk to us, see us. Sometimes I feel like as marketing communications professionals, we're kind of removed from them sometimes, but here's the space you can have that direct access. And it's also a great space if you have a need for maybe a photo shoot you're doing, if you are saying like, hey, I'm really interested in writing a mental health story this month for athletics. Is anyone interested in, do we know any student athletes that might be interested in that, or friends that, want to volunteer to be in the space? And then just invite them to DM you or to email you. I've had really great partnerships that have just come out of this channel. Some examples are Scotch and Soda Theater and Scotty Survivor. With Scotch and Soda Theater, this was kind of back early during the pandemic time, but I think I had just reached out into Slack, like it was the summer or like late summer. I was just looking for content. I said, hey, do any student orgs, would you like to just be featured? And I met one of the PR chairs, Remy Goldberg, who was an awesome person. And when I started talking with her, she was telling me, just again through casual conversation about how they're trying to think of what they can do for a show. Now that this was at a time that we were all remote. And from that, I was like, this is such a really great CMU story, because it's again thinking about how these students can be, these passionate students are thinking of these innovative ways to be able to perform one of their passions, right? And do this on top of their academic work, which is just always amazing to me. So I was like, hey, this could be a story for the Piper. Like, this isn't just something that we can share on social, right? So I actually ended up writing a story for the Piper. But then because I had established that relationship with them, I could, you know, I, I established this relationship and I could lean on it at other points throughout the year. For example, when I was thinking about writing, doing a story for Pride Month, I really wanted to do a story on explaining what the different colors of the Pride flag mean. And instead of just posting a photo with a flag, I was like, maybe we can get creative around this because I know Scotch and Soda has these really beautiful stage lit photos with their specific colors that they use. Again, the colored lights that they use. And so I reached out to Remy and I was like, hey, this is the story that we're doing. I think your group is also a great space for this because of the values that you also represent. And so I was able, and she was super into it. I was able to use their photos. I even got a quote, I think, from Remy in there that just talks about how theater is a space that embraces the LGBTQ community. So it just really fit well together. But it was so much easier to ask her for that content because I had already made that connection with her, expressed interest in what she did. And then now I had that knowledge that I could easily reach out and, reach out to them. I won't go in depth on it, but something similar happened with Scotty Survivor. One of the original founders of it was Govind Menon, who used to be the student body president. So that was a great connection that, one, we did a Piper story on them too, but throughout the year, I've done stuff with them on social. It's definitely fun content there for sure. But I mean, it was such an interesting group, again, bringing this here. And yeah, being able to connect with Govind, who has a lot of influence in his space, was such a great opportunity for me because then throughout the year he would send me stuff that we could share on Life with CMU, and I could also reach out to him to bounce ideas off of stuff and whatnot. So it was a great partnership, and that was all again because I just gave them a space that we could talk and kind of, again, even if you're just reaching out on social for things that you see and are just DMing people, it's just like if you're walking up to someone on the street that you think that they're doing something interesting, right? It's about the people and being interested in people. I also just wanted to call out that I think building a diverse team really, really affects your content and your storytelling. Like thinking about who is taking your photos, who are writing these stories. Everyone brings their own unique lens to things, and also fits more organically in certain environments. And I mean that in the case of, for example, the University Communications and Marketing social media team last year, and maybe even the year prior, my dates are always mixed up. They hired a team of student photographers and the photos were so fantastic. Like their feed, in my opinion, completely changed because, I mean, yes, we have other great photographers on staff, but there's something about, like, if want to be a student focused channel, that actually getting students to take the photos is so empowering because they can fit in these spaces that me standing there trying to take a photo at an event, or maybe again slipping into one of the restaurants on campus and trying to get pictures of people eating. It's not as natural as if a student was just in there doing that. So again, think about if you're capturing content in some of your spaces, who are the people that are most likely to have that inside view or to connect with that audience, and can you employ those people? And also lean on these people to get feedback when you can. And I don't mean it in the sense of like just reaching out to a person because they are somehow connected to the subject. I mean, like, you already have built that relationship with them, like we were talking about earlier. And because then again, it shows that you value their opinion. So again, you're only strengthening that relationship, and you're able to bounce ideas off someone if maybe you're not unsure about something or you're uncomfortable. And again, just going back to that uncomfortability, I think it's a good thing. But if you're really feeling uncomfortable to the point where you might think you might say something inappropriate or mess up, like, reach out to people that are experts in this space. The Center for Diversity and Inclusion is a great ally to have if you have a really specific question. But yeah, just think about, again, leaning on resources or doing your own deep dive yourself, maybe doing some education if you feel uncomfortable. Yeah. So this was actually a concept brought to me, although I've definitely seen it. I've never thought about it or heard of it framed this way. And this was actually brought to Mandy Semple, my director, and I's attention when we were part of a workshop with the Office of the Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion. Mark D'Angelo and Byron Martin were talking about when the award-winning broadcast journalist and host Soledad O'Brien was on campus. She was giving the keynote address for the Carnegie Mellon annual celebration of the Dr. Martin Luther King series. And she was talking about Travian Shorters and his concept called asset framing. And it's this idea from deficit to asset framings. And you can see a quote from him here. How do we create equitable outcomes for all members of our community? We can start by defining people by their aspirations and not their challenges. And for any of you who don't know, Travian Shorters is a social entrepreneur, and he's an advocate for this adoption of asset framing. And he also does a lot of work too around the narratives around Black men in the community. But so again, this concept is really thinking about when we are telling stories, what is the language that we're using to describe students? Because it does how we view and interact with them. Are we feeding into negative cultural narratives and stereotypes when we're writing? So an example of this would be if we're thinking about maybe writing a story, again, let's say an example of a student athlete, and, aside from, that they're going to school to now be this rocket scientist, they also are founding a startup based on one of their passions. Maybe we know that they come from a place of poverty and we want to, frame that as part of the story to kind of to show how they overcame hardships in their life. Well, if you're thinking maybe about, writing this as this, came from a background where, whoever was an at-risk youth, that's language that kind of feeds into this deficit framing. For example, when you're thinking about communities that are labeled at risk, it causes our brain to associate at risk with the youth. So you're really almost thinking that the youth is the problem instead of rather the ones experience the problem. Also, you're ignoring the fact that they come from this more systemic place of poverty, right? And again, not, limiting the use agency in the minds of the reader and even potentially themselves. So it's really just thinking about how can you put these positive things that people are working toward always at that start of the article, like that should always be what you're focusing on. And then of course, if they have these other instances in their life, that are part of their story, also bringing them up, but being very careful about the language that we use to identify them and talk about them, and to be aware that we're not feeding into any of these negative stereotypes, right? And I thought this is kind of a heavier topic, it's an amazing topic, and I obviously can't cover it all again within this hour. So I just wanted to show you that there is a link to the blog below that I think did a really great job at explaining this. And then I also want you to be able to hear from Travian Shorters as well, because I think just if you hear this, it's just so powerful.
Asset framing is about not defining people by their challenge, right? So once you recognize that I aspire to be a scientist or a leader, or maybe I just aspire to graduate high school, I have a goal to be a student, right? Whatever that aspiration is, if you acknowledge that aspiration before you go into my various challenges, you're telling a truer story about me, right? I don't run around believing I'm an at-risk this or a low-income that or a high poverty, high crime. Like no one carries around those labels thinking that's how I'm going to face the world, right? What people think about is I want to maybe go to school. I want to maybe someday own a home. I want to maybe possibly get out of this neighborhood or come back to this neighborhood and build. Whatever that person's aspiration is, if you haven't bothered to acknowledge that aspiration before you engage them, then you've made them an object in the sentence. They are a thing to be dealt with, to be moved, to be manipulated. They are not a person. And once you start to engage people as obstacles, once you start engaging people as problems, then recognize that you've now become the problem, right?
So yeah, I just think such a powerful way to think of when we're talking and interviewing students, faculty members, staff, to just really think about that asset framing strategy in our storytelling. And I think this kind of also goes into this as well, but remembering that people are more than just sound bites and headlines, right? I've seen all different percentages on this. I saw anything from 40 to even like 80%, but the most recent one I saw was 59% of all links shared on social networks aren't clicked on at all, implying most articles aren't based on missed article shares aren't based on actual reading. So you really, one thing that I just want to make people aware is also thinking about how you're writing your headlines is just as important as the full story, right? And how are we framing people with our headlines? I think, nowadays we see those very short caption headlines that are meant to grab people's attention. But again, it's really hard to boil someone's life and essence and whatever down into that headline. But when you're writing them, trying to remember that, to assume that people won't click on the full story, but definitely to always provide that space to link to that full story. Because again, we want to be able to show this whole story of a person, to not just limit them down to the caption. But again, think about being strategic when you are writing those, that you aren't doing any of this deficit framing in there, that you aren't, using any type of stereotypes, embedded in that caption. And then my kind of step 3, so after we're, thinking about planning about writing the story, using some strategies while you're writing the story, this is kind of that reflection period, right? So, I always just hear like, let's base this on analytics. What do the analytics say? What does the data say? And while that 100% is important, you have to think about beyond the analytics, especially on social media, because analytics are a great tool for developing social strategies, but they cannot be our primary tool. For an example of this, I know that when I used to give that social presentation with Felicia from Central Social Media, some of the best performing content that they would have are any times that they did like a pet or animal feature, right? Another time was when Kobe Bryant had passed away and students painted the fence. Well, if I was just looking at that data, my takeaway could be, well, we're going to mainly make the main CMU account animals of dogs and cat, or pictures of dogs and cats, and always focusing on fence content, right? But we know that that account can't solely focus on that, right? Like, we know that there are some stories that need to be told that might not always have the most engagement, but they're important and they need to be shared, and they're important in creating a sense of belonging, right? Also, I just want to point out that analytics are also a reflection of the algorithm. For example, like if we are looking at any social media stats right now, I'm sure you're seeing that Reels on Instagram, for example, are the #1 thing to make or to utilize. Like, your content should be Reels. It's the only way you get seen. You'll have the best analytics if you use Reels, right, versus a photo. Well, Instagram also prioritizes Reels in their algorithm, so that's their choice that they're making. So obviously, because they're showing real content to more people, your Reels are going to look like they have better analytics on them, right? So you have to kind of be thinking of this more holistically, again, of how this ties into your entire strategy. And again, using analytics and data to inform, but not to dictate your entire strategy. Like I said, there are some stories that need to be told that might not always get the most engagement, but they still need to be seen, and people can't be always boiled down to a data point, right? So our social channels are a huge asset in space for us to tell these stories, again, that need to be seen, need to be heard, need to be amplified. And then lastly, I think also just, creating some type of social media guidelines, developing a set of best practices and guidelines. I have it linked here to what our CMU social media guidelines are, just, to kind of get you started. But they're great to, especially if maybe you're having staff turnover, if you have student turnover, they really help you to have this consistent brand voice. For example, if you are experiencing a time, for instance, where, people are negatively commenting on maybe one of your posts, right? Like, if you have these guidelines in place, and how do you react to that? Do you hide the comments? Do you, block the user? What are some like guidelines around this? And typically we don't do that type of thing. But again, it just helps you to be prepared. Also, it's a way to communicate your values, right? Like, if you have a guideline that says we're going to use pronouns every time we mention someone's, name, that's a way that you can be consistent then across your brand of always using pronouns and showcasing that, that's something, that's a value that's important to you in this space. So I definitely think, having a set of guidelines, and also just, thinking about how the university looks at them as well is just an important part of, again, your social strategy. And that is my presentation for today. I am always here if you need advice, if you want to sit down and kind of talk through your social. Please utilize my email at the beginning of the presentation. Like I said, if you'd like invited to the Slack channel, love to have you there. Thank you so much to the Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion for inviting me.